ancestral to us. They were regarded as an odd side branch of apes that walked erect. It wasn't until the 1950s when overwhelming evidence of more and more of these things and anatomical analyses essentially forced us to acknowledge their prototypically human characteristics. The main reason for the denial was that most scientists firmly believed in the theory of Asian origins. All right, that's stage one, the desire to see it all beginning in Asia. There's a stage two, just as there was for morphology, where you admit, okay, the Australopithecine evidence is overwhelming. There's no way I can get around that. That's correct. Therefore, we must allow that the initial origin of humanity is in Africa. However, you can still salvage the Asian theory in the following way. You say, all right, it all started in Africa, but we were pretty primitive then. When you get to the level of Homo erectus spreads out into Asia. Homo erectus is the ancestor of intelligent human life. Homo erectus is an Asian species. So although we might have split from the chimpanzee lineage in Africa, as Homo erectus, we evolved intelligence in Asia. That's stage two. Problem is that doesn't work very well either. Guess why? Because Homo erectus has now been found in Africa as well, and the oldest Homo erectuses are in Africa. So it looks as though Homo erectus also evolved in Africa and then spread out, so that the Java and Peking populations are the descendants of African migrants. You can still save, and some people have tried and still are trying, you can still save the Asian theory by saying, all right, I have to admit that too. Homo erectus evolved in Africa, that's true. But at least Homo sapiens, our own species, Homo sapiens evolved in Asia or Europe, right? Well, that issue is unresolved. But based on evidence I'm going to present in a moment, it begins to look more and more as though Homo sapiens also evolved in Africa, that all human species evolved in Africa, that Homo erectus may have spread out into Asia, but it's not those populations that gave rise to us, and we are all the descendants of a stock of Homo sapiens that emerged from Homo erectus in Africa, like every other species. All right, I will rapidly move into the next part of the talk, which is on the reasons for my biological claim that human equality is a contingent fact of history. The paleontological evidence combined with the genetic evidence is getting clearer and clearer. First of all, the whole human lineage is very young. I don't mean just the division of Homo sapiens into races. The whole story of the Australopithecines and Homo erectus and anything that came after, because the best biochemical dates and the more we understand about the fossil record seems to be falling into line, indicates that the split of the human from the chimp lineage occurred in Africa probably no more than 6 to 7 million years ago. And that's not a whole lot of time for everything. So the whole human lineage is young. But that's not really the subject of this talk. This talk is about the much later division of our modern species, Homo sapiens, into races. Now remember, all the old arguments claim, and there's no other way to support a claim for racial inequalities, that the species, that the racial divisions within Homo sapiens are very ancient and may go back as far as the level of our ancestral species, Homo erectus. But there's now substantial evidence indicating that that is not so, that the origin of Homo sapiens was a specific historical event in Africa that occurred within the last 100 to 200,000 years, which is a geological yesterday, that the whole story of the migration of Homo erectus into Asia, probably the whole story of the migration of Neanderthal man into Europe, has nothing to do with our ancestry, that these are lineages that died out without issue, and that we are the product of a very recent event of speciation in Africa through the origin of Homo sapiens. And that brings me then to the centerpiece. What I'm reporting on now is an article by Can, Stone King, and Alan Wilson that appeared in the British journal Nature about 7 or 8 months ago. What Can, Stone King, and Wilson did is as follows. They work with mitochondrial DNA. There's a very good reason for doing that. I think probably most of you know that the mitochondria of your cells, that is the energy factories within your cells, have a certain amount of genetic material associated with them, as they have their own genomes. Now, there are two reasons why you use mitochondrial DNA and why only mitochondrial DNA could really resolve the issue of the topology of branching on the human tree. The first reason is that mitochondrial DNA has an extremely simple pattern of inheritance. That is, sperm contain no mitochondria, or no mitochondria that get in and fertilize the egg. What of a sperm enters an egg cell is only the nucleus. It's only the nuclear genes. Therefore, all your mitochondria you got from your mother. The second and more important reason for using mitochondrial DNA to resolve this issue is that, for reasons we don't fully understand, but that seems well documented, mitochondrial DNA evolves much faster, on average, than nuclear DNA, about 10 times as fast. And the division of Homo sapiens into races has been so recent that if we use nuclear DNA with its average slow rates of evolution, not enough change would have accumulated even to be able to measure the differences. So we have to use the mitochondrial DNA. Now, they got a sample of 147 people. Not nearly enough. This is very preliminary. We'll know more. It'll be better resolved in a few years. But these 147 people included all major racial groups. They got whites, they got Orientals, they got various groups of Africans, they got people from Australia and New Guinea. And they compared the mitochondrial DNA sequence of these 147 human beings. They then constructed the evolutionary tree of branching based on mitochondrial similarities, following the obvious assumption that the greater the difference in mitochondrial sequence, the longer the time of separation of the groups represented by those particular people. The first conclusion they reach is that when you make the most probable tree of human evolution from the mitochondrial differences, that tree has a stunningly simple topology. Basically, there are two branches. Okay? And they unite at some point. One branch includes only people from Africa. The other branch includes other people from Africa, plus absolutely everybody else. And then the two branches join. Now, the only conclusion you can draw, if that is the correct topology, is that all humans evolved initially in Africa, and then one lineage splitting in Africa yielded all the migrants that went out and colonized the rest of the world. Now, that's only half the story, because I think many of you will appreciate, and will have already appreciated, that that in itself doesn't give you anything. Because we've admitted for a long time that humans evolved in Africa. I haven't told you anything about time. We have to know when those two branches come together in Africa. Maybe it was 2 million years ago. If it happened 2 million years ago, that's back at the level of Australopithecines. Maybe it was 1 million years ago, which means that it happened at the level of Homo erectus. So maybe our racial differences are deep. That only proves the African origin. It doesn't say anything about the timing. To make the inference about timing, you have to make another assumption. And this assumption is admittedly more tenuous. You assume that mitochondrial DNA changes at a constant average rate, and that average rate can be specified because there's now in the literature a wide variety of studies when we do have good paleontological evidence for the actual timings of branching events, all of which are consistent with the postulate that in widely differing lineages, on average, mitochondrial DNA evolves at the same rate, and we know what that rate is. Now, if the assumption holds that that measured average rate across many different lineages of mitochondrial DNA also is true for human beings, then the following really stunning conclusion emerges from this study. Namely, that the two branches of the tree, one containing all Africans, one containing other Africans plus everybody else, join in Africa somewhere between about 150 and 250,000 years ago. But the branch that then is responsible for all non-African racial variation divides within itself somewhere between 90 and I think 180,000 years ago. So that the origin of all racial diversity involved in this argument about inequality, namely differences between blacks, whites, and yellows, is all a product of the last 100,000 years or so. It's not the millions of the Australopithecines. It's not the hundreds of thousands of Homo erectus. It's that tiny little geological microsecond of the last 100,000 years at most, if these data are correct and if the assumption of constant rates holds. And that just simply, and this is the so-called bottom line of the whole talk, that simply is just not enough time for much in the way of substantial differences to evolve, and that is affirmed in the direct evidence. In short, the conclusion is simply this, there's astonishingly little genetic difference among us. No one has ever, for example, discovered what you might call a race gene. That is, a state of the gene present in all members of one race and none of another. There are many differences in gene frequencies, to be sure. Blood groups differ. Skin color differs, as you know. But almost all the variation is within coherent groups. Very little is added by putting new groups into the sample. In fact, about 80% of the variation in Homo sapiens is within coherent groups. That's how little, on average, we differ one from the other as a result of the high degree of variation within each group. Now, let me reiterate, before I get into my epilogue, what I said at the very beginning. Why is it that human equality is a contingent fact of history? Because the split was recent among our races, and there has not been time for the development of much separation. But I remind you, it need not have been. One can develop, because history is so massively contingent, 100 other scenarios. I remind you that the robust Australopithecines might have survived. What if they had? As I said earlier,